"You're a disgrace!" That's what my daughter shouted, in front of the entire family, as if I were some stranger. And the most curious part? I didn't argue back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand respect. I simply opened a folder I had carried with me for years and let the truth speak for itself. This story isn't just about family betrayal. It's about silence, dignity, and a turning point no one saw coming. Because what I revealed that night wasn't just a stack of papers. It was the portrait of a lifetime of sacrifices that had been erased until that very moment. And before you think this is just another wounded father venting, let me tell you something. This story could be yours too. If you've ever been belittled by those who should have honored you, what happened to me might serve as your mirror or your warning. You know that kind of silence that isn't empty but heavy, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only judgment? That was the sound that filled the room when my daughter shouted, her voice steady, her eyes burning with contempt. "You're a disgrace!" No background music, no nervous laughter, just the echo of betrayal pounding in the ears of everyone there. And trust me, nobody forgot that moment. She said it with the coldness of someone who never had to hold my hand in a hospital or wipe the sweat from my forehead after a full day of work. She spoke as if she hadn't grown up with brand new school supplies every year or her own private bedroom while I slept in the living room. Right there, in front of uncles, cousins, neighbors, colleagues, people I respected, she reduced me to dust. That's when the word betrayal takes on a new weight. Because it wasn't a stranger who cut me down. It was my own blood. The little girl I once walked to school, taught to count with beans at the kitchen table, comforted when she was afraid of the dark. To scream disgrace at me in front of everyone was like spitting on every year of sacrifice, love, and hard-earned dignity, a moral knife twisted in public. And the way she said it, it was as if she was freeing herself from a burden, as if I were an error she needed to erase in front of them all. The arrogance in her tone, so calculated, made it clear this wasn't impulse. This was rehearsed, and no one stepped in. Because sadly, in many families, when the young disrespect the old, the discomfort is so sharp that everyone prefers to pretend they didn't hear. If you think people will side with justice, think again. What I saw were eyes darting sideways, hands nervously gripping glasses, forced smiles trying to preserve the festive atmosphere. But not one person, not a single soul, had the courage to defend a father being publicly humiliated by his own daughter. The weight of that silence hurt, just as much as her words. Funny thing is, I've seen men praised as heroes for much less. A Christmas gift a little more expensive, saying yes during a sibling quarrel, and suddenly they're celebrated. But one sentence dripping with ingratitude, like the one I heard, can rewrite your story instantly. Public humiliation inside a family is a silent poison. It doesn't kill all at once. It corrodes little by little. First dignity, then trust, finally love. And the cruelest part, in that moment, I realized I was alone in the middle of a crowd, the same man who made sure there was food, shelter, education, even the luxuries she loved to flaunt. The same man who said no to himself 1,000 times just to say yes to her. And ironically, her outburst came at the very moment I least expected it, when I thought I had finally built a home where respect would be the strongest inheritance. But you know what I learned that night? Sometimes, the loudest scream doesn't come from the mouth. It comes from silence. And in that silence, thick, heavy, filled with restrained indignation, I started to remember everything that brought me there. Because humiliation doesn't erase history. It doesn't undo sacrifice. It doesn't rewrite truth. It may wound, but it also reveals who truly deserves to stand beside you. Maybe that's why, instead of exploding, I just took a deep breath. Because sometimes the best response is letting the other person hear their own echo. She wanted me to fight back. She wanted a scene. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Because dignity doesn't scream. Dignity stands tall, even when everything around it tries to tear it down. As everyone stared, waiting for me to react, I just looked at my daughter. Inside, yes, something broke. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. But at the same time, something was born, a new awareness, a quiet liberation, the realization that I didn't have to prove myself to anyone anymore, least of all, to her. And that was the moment the story began to change. But nobody there imagined what I carried with me that night. And I know what you're thinking, but it was just a party. And you're right, it was supposed to be. One of those easy nights where everyone laughs at old stories, where toasts warm the heart instead of wounding the memory. But in families, nothing is ever just what it seems. What should have been a celebration turned, before my eyes, into a courtroom without walls, and I was sentenced before I even said a word. It was supposed to be special, a big family gathering that took months to plan. My older sister's 70th birthday, generations coming together. Nephews, grandkids, cousins I hadn't seen in decades. The house decorated, the table overflowing, people in suits and dresses sipping wine as if it were Christmas out of season. I even helped pay for part of the party, proudly. I remember arriving with a discreet smile, the kind you save for important moments. I've always been the quiet type, the one who observes before speaking, but I was happy to be there, because despite the cracks, family is still family, right? At least that's what I believed, until I heard my daughter label me a disgrace, loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't criticism, it was a verdict, and in that instant, the hall turned into a courtroom. It's strange how everything changes in seconds. Just minutes before, I was chatting with a cousin about renovations at my farmhouse. A couple quietly complimented me on the way I raised my kids. I'd even been offered a seat at the main table, but all it took was that phrase, "You're a disgrace," and suddenly the smiles became masks, the glances became blades. The betrayal wasn't just hers, it was everyone's who chose to stay silent. And when that happens, there's no, going back. That brightly lit room, scented with fresh flowers and soft music, became suffocating. You know when an environment seems to push you out, as if every detail is programmed to remind you, you don't belong here anymore. That's exactly how it felt. Every piece of the party turned into irony. The red carpet I helped rent, the food I taste-tested before the caterer finalized the menu, even the expensive dress she wore, a gift from me, paid in 3 installments. What hurt me the most wasn't even the shout. It was the fact that no one corrected her, no looks of disapproval, no attempt to soften the moment. It was as if everyone had been waiting for that scene, as if they had swallowed for years little distorted stories about me, and now finally they had a public reason to point the finger. And the cruelest part, it happened at a party I had helped build, at an event that, in a way, celebrated the very values I once taught them. That's the problem with family relationships when respect is gone. You don't need a courtroom. The judgment happens in the stares, in the lack of defense, in the silence of those who should protect you. Education becomes decoration, dignity left at the mercy of the atmosphere, and the respect you fought so hard to cultivate melts away like a candle in the wind. It's in moments like these you discover who is really with you, and who was only benefiting from your presence while it was convenient. And I don't know if you've ever gone through something like this, but I'll tell you, it hurts more than any slap across the face. Because when betrayal comes from your own daughter and is endorsed by everyone else's silence, it doesn't just bruise the ego, it pierces the soul, it shatters the foundation you thought was solid, and it forces you to see everything with new eyes. But right then and there, with my eyes burning, but refusing to let a tear fall, I remembered the folder, that brown folder, old on the outside, but full of proof on the inside. It was my paper vault, contracts, receipts, deeds, tuition slips, bank transfers, tax returns, all organized by date and purpose. I'd never shown it to anyone, always kept it private. But in that moment, something inside me whispered, it's time. Time to show that behind the silence, there was a story that needed to be heard. When someone points a finger at you in public and erases everything you've done for them, the pain doesn't come only from the humiliation. It comes from memory, because memory is treacherous. It drags back everything you did quietly, everything no one saw, but that kept the world turning for the very person now calling you a disgrace. And right there, standing, judged, an avalanche of memories began to crush me from within. I remembered the years of working double shifts. Mornings in the furniture workshop, nights as a security guard at a supermarket warehouse, coming home with the smell of sawdust mixed with dust, dark circles under my eyes so deep they looked like bruises. But she slept peacefully. There was milk, there was fruit. Her uniform was pressed, her lunchbox filled with juice and cookies. Me, I ate leftovers, sometimes just a cold cup of coffee. But that was how I said, I love you, without ever needing to say it out loud. Wow. How could I forget the sleepless nights when she was sick? It was me holding her head as she vomited. Me making lemon and onion tea. Yes, onion, a desperate father's recipe. If she shook with fever, my chest became her pillow. I read medicine labels like they were treasure maps, because in a way, they were. The treasure was seeing her better the next day. Toothless smile, sleepy eyes, but alive and well. There was one time I'll never forget when she asked for new sneakers, a pink pair with shiny details all the girls at school had. I knew I couldn't afford them, but I also knew she'd feel less than the others without them. So I sold my old bicycle, the same one I used to get to work. For a month I walked over 4 miles each day, came home dripping with sweat, but she walked into school smiling. That was what mattered to me. Funny how sacrifice, when it isn't spoken about, ends up erased. We think we're teaching by example, and often we are. But other people's memory rarely carries the same tenderness as our own. Years later, what was once effort becomes obligation. What was once love turns into emotional debt. She didn't remember, or pretended not to remember, that it was my hand that signed the loan for her first car, that it was my name that secured her college enrollment. But for years, I stopped, living so she could live better. I never traveled, never bought new clothes for myself. Whenever money was left over, it went to her. English classes, a short exchange program, even that overpriced tablet she needed for schoolwork. And I believed it, because that's what a father's love is, believing, even when the bills scream that you can't. Dignity, to me, was making sure she had what I never had. There were Christmases when my dinner was instant, noodles with an egg, but hers had turkey, sweetbread, and presents under the tree, because I never wanted her to feel ashamed of her childhood. The house was simple, but clean. The furniture second-hand, but sturdy. The ripped couch, stitched by my own hands. And every wall in that house carried the same sweat I carried on my body. She grew up in a home built from sacrifice, and still thought it was fair to call me a disgrace. Do you know the problem? The values we teach at home don't always win against the vanity the world feeds outside. I taught respect. The world taught appearances. I offered values. The world offered status. And in this silent war between humility and vanity, she chose the side that shines brighter in photos, but fades faster in the soul. Maybe because for her, love became obligation, and obligation, when it isn't acknowledged, becomes meaningless debt. One day she asked me why I never complained. I smiled and said, because complaining doesn't put food in the fridge. And it's true. I learned that from my father, a farmhand with calloused hands and a soft heart. Complaining is a luxury for those who can afford to wait, and I never could. Life demanded urgency, focus, resilience. That's how I raised my daughter, with silent love, invisible discipline, and daily sacrifices she never understood, and maybe never will. But, here's where life's revenge comes in, because time, when it doesn't give answers, delivers reflections. And in that moment, standing in the middle of that party, hearing the hidden judgment of people who had no idea what I'd lived through, something inside me shifted. Not into anger, but into clarity. The clarity that the problem wasn't what I hadn't done. The problem was that I had done so much that she thought it was ordinary, as if I were nothing more than an employee of her existence. Akish, and that, my friend, is the blind spot of ingratitude. It only grows where there was once too much giving. When we give everything, we teach others to expect everything. And the day we stop giving, we become villains. The line between respect and dependency is razor thin, and without realizing it, I had raised someone who confused love with obligation, presence with servitude, sacrifice with weakness. And now, there I was, carrying that invisible burden. Still, even with all of this burning inside me, I refused to react, because someone who has lived with dignity doesn't need an audience to prove their worth. And in that silence, filled with memories, sweat, and sleepless nights, I began to prepare myself. Because inside that folder were the tracks of my past. And if the world wanted proof, then proof was exactly what it was about to get. Ingratitude never starts with a shout. It begins with a look, with the subtle glance away, the forced smile, the disguised absence of presence. It creeps in through silences, through small gestures that, on their own, seem trivial. But when you piece them together, you realize you've been pushed out of the story for a long time. That shout that night was only the final chapter of a book I had been pretending not to read. It started slowly. First, she stopped calling, always said she was busy. Then, she began forgetting important dates. My birthday, for example. One year, she sent me a short voice note, late at night, half asleep. Dad, happy birthday, okay? I'm swamped. The message lasted 9 seconds. And me? I had spent the entire day waiting for a call, sitting by the phone like a boy waiting for a toy that never arrives. Foolish, maybe, but a father's heart is made of silent expectations. Over time, the invitations dwindled. Sunday dinners became rare events. When I called, I felt her impatience, as if my voice interrupted something more important. Once, I mentioned a book I had read, trying to spark a conversation. She replied, "Ugh, Dad, that old stuff. Nobody thinks like that anymore." That word, old, cut deeper than I wanted to admit, because it wasn't about age, it was about disdain. And disdain is the waiting room of humiliation. I saw the signs, but ignored them. Told myself it was just a phase. Every father does. You think it's just the rush of life, that she's tired, that things will soon return to normal. But what returned was distance, coldness, a kind of polite contempt disguised as independence. She began making big decisions without me. Changed jobs, bought a new car, moved to another city, without a word. I found out through others, or through social media. The breaking point was when she joked, "Dad, your opinions are so outdated. If you worked at a company, you'd already be fired." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, out of politeness, but inside, something tore. Because I realized then the problem wasn't just perspective, it was affection, connection. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't bleed on the outside, but hollows you from within. And here's the cruelest part. When people start treating you like a burden, the worst pain isn't what they say, it's what they don't say. The "I thank you" that never comes. The "how are you" that vanishes. The "I love you" that disappears without ceremony. It's those absences that create holes. And holes in family relationships turn into abysses that are nearly impossible to cross. And in that abyss I stayed, for years, trying to build bridges she never stepped on. But everything has roots. And if I was honest with myself, I saw that part of it was my responsibility too. Because sometimes we love so much that we forget to teach limits. I said yes when I should have said no. I protected when I should have let her fall. And most of all, I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I thought I was raising her with love. But love without direction turns into servitude, and servitude teaches the other person to believe you'll always be available, even when you're wounded. She confused respect with convenience. As long as I was solving problems, I was useful. As long as I was signing papers, covering bills, untangling bureaucracy, I was the best dad in the world. But the moment I got older, slowed down, started saying I can't, my value began to vanish. Because some people don't love you, they love what you provide. They love what you represent. And when you no longer serve that purpose, they trade love for criticism and gratitude for ingratitude. The most perverse thing about ingratitude is that it stays silent until it's convenient. It doesn't arrive shouting, it corrodes. First through forgetfulness, then through indifference, and finally through accusation. That's exactly what happened. And that night at the party, her shout was only the conclusion of a story she had written alone. I was just there, in the final chapter, not knowing I had been cast as the villain. And you know what? Accepting that isn't easy, especially when it's family. Family should be a place of respect, dignity, and belonging. But when there's no reciprocity, everything tilts. The one who gives the most usually ends up hurt the most. Because in a world that sees vulnerability as weakness, a father who loves too much is called outdated. A father who gives everything is mistaken for someone weak. But I wasn't weak. I was a father. I was the man who held it together when she wanted to drop out of college. The one who passed the hat among friends to pay for her dental surgery. The one who fought with the bank manager when she fell for an online scam. And still, she thought it fair to cut me down in front of everyone, to call me a disgrace. And for me, that was more than humiliation. It was confirmation that the bond was already broken, and she didn't even realize it. But life teaches one thing. Those who forget their roots eventually trip over their own pride. And in that crowded hall, surrounded by eyes, I realized there was no point waiting for recognition anymore. It was time to show, with proof, everything she tried to erase with words. And from that moment, my silence stopped being weakness and began to transform into silent revenge. A revenge not fueled by anger, but by truth. Everyone expected me to explode, and honestly, part of me wanted to. I wanted to shout, slam the table, point my finger, unload everything I'd been holding in for years. But something inside me, bigger than my wounded pride, stopped me. It was as if my body had made a decision my mouth hadn't yet caught up with. I remained silent, not out of cowardice, but for something few people understand: dignity. Some think silence means weakness, but in reality, it takes incredible strength to swallow words that burn inside you. It takes courage not to retaliate when you're right. It takes Maturity to realize not every stage deserves a performance. And there, in that room, I understood that my silence would be far more eloquent than any speech, because someone who carries history doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. While she accused me with anger and contempt, I just looked at her, not with coldness, but with disbelief. Disbelief at what she had become, or maybe at what she had always been, and I refused to see. Each sentence from her was like a hammer blow against everything I had built with such effort. And still, I stayed quiet, because I knew in that moment any reaction would be twisted against me. When you answer with anger, they call you unstable. When you answer firmly, they call you harsh. But silence is unpredictable, and that makes it powerful. Have you ever noticed how silence makes people more uncomfortable than shouting? Ever seen someone squirm under a steady, wordless gaze? I did. I saw it in her eyes. I saw it in the unease of the others. They expected an explosion, a scene, a meltdown, but all they got was a man standing tall, breathing deep, holding his soul in his own hands. And strangely enough, that was the moment the game began to turn, because silence has the power to reveal what noise tries to hide. You know, I spent my whole life hearing that real men don't cry, but standing there, in the middle of that party, my eyes welled up, not out of weakness, but out of grief. The grief of a father who lost his daughter to her own ego. The grief of a man who realized that respect, when it isn't nurtured, gets lost along the way. But still, I didn't let the tears fall. I took a deep breath, and I clung to the only thing I had left, my dignity. That word, dignity, sounds beautiful, but it's rarely understood. Some people confuse it with pride, others mistake it for vanity. But dignity, to me, has always been something else. It's knowing your worth, even when the world tries to devalue you. It's keeping your head high when every part of you wants to collapse and disappear. It's refusing to lower yourself just to prove a point, because someone with dignity doesn't argue to convince, they live to show. And that's exactly what I did. I stood there, still, like a living statue of everything I had built. I didn't need to say a word. My silence was heavy with stories. Stories of sacrifice, of love, of renunciation. Stories she seemed to have forgotten, but that lived on in every wrinkle of my face, in every callus on my hands. Life had taught me that silence can be a complete and often final answer. What struck me most was how others reacted to it. At first, their eyes looked at me with expectation, like people watching a reality show, waiting for the next scene. But slowly, those same looks began to shift. They grew uneasy, uncertain. They started to realize something was wrong in her posture, and something very right in mine. Because while she shouted, I stood tall, and little by little, the weight of guilt began to shift. And that night, silence became a mirror that didn't reflect my pain, but the moral misery of the one attacking me. And that unsettled them, because when dignity steps into the room, it forces everyone to rethink their judgments. I felt it in the way they avoided eye contact, as if my calmness had become a spotlight, exposing the shadows of that injustice. And in that moment, without realizing it, I was already winning. But don't think it was easy. Staying quiet when you have everything to say is one of the hardest tests of self-control a person can face. It's like holding back a dam with your bare hands. But I knew my moment to speak would come, and when it did, it wouldn't be with a shout. It would be with proof, concrete, undeniable proof. And it was right there with me, in the corner of the room, inside a worn brown leather folder, smelling of old paper and guarded truth. That folder had years of life inside it. Dark leather, frayed edges, stitching coming loose, a clasp that sometimes stuck. It looked ordinary, the kind you'd find in an old office, forgotten on a shelf. But inside was my entire life, literally. It was my silent vault, not of money, of evidence. Proof no one had ever seen. Proof I never planned to reveal until that night. I've always been organized, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. When you don't have much, you learn to value every cent, every signature, every official stamp. And I knew that one day I might need them, not for revenge, but for protection. So I saved everything. Receipts, contracts, payment slips, school enrollments, bills, bank statements, loans I took out for her, even the one that almost cost me my house. While the hall was still heavy, glasses frozen in midair, eyes stuck on me as if I were a ghost on stage. I walked over to the corner where I had left my backpack. I opened it calmly, pulled out the folder. Just the act of holding it changed the air. There was a subtle stir, a collective whisper. It was as if everyone felt something was about to happen, but didn't know what. I placed the folder on the table, opened it with a sharp snap, and began pulling out the papers one by one without saying a single word. First, the deed to the apartment she had lived in since she was 23. Then, the financing contract for the car she proudly claimed she had bought with her own hard work. Then, the receipts for 4 full years of private university tuition, every one of them paid by me, with dates, stamps, even highlighted notes I'd made for my own control. The people drew closer, unsure if they should. Some pretended to glance from afar. Others leaned over from behind, trying to read over my shoulder. Her mother, my ex-wife, froze in place. Her husband, who always looked at me with arrogance, folded his arms tightly, as if trying to contain himself. And her, my daughter, went pale. The once defiant, confident expression began to crumble, not into tears, but into shame. Pure, unfiltered shame. I kept going, pulled out the bank statements from the joint account I had kept for years in her name. Money that paid for her trips, her courses, even the baby clothes for her first child. I laid out the letter I had written when she got into college, next to the deposit I made to help her move. There were so many documents they barely fit on the table, and among them, one photograph, her at 6 years old, smiling in the brand new school uniform I had bought that same month I had to put the gas bill on installments. And you know what hurt the most? That I had to show it, that I had to prove it, that I had to expose myself just to defend who I was. Because in a healthy relationship, one built on respect, no father should need to prove he helped build his child's life. A father's love should never require paperwork. But that night, showing it was necessary, not for her, for me, so that I wouldn't forget, and wouldn't let the others forget, the man I had been. Those papers weren't just sheets. They were fragments of my history, pieces of my struggle, marks of my presence. And as everyone read in silence, I thought about how cruel it is that life could corner a father into justifying his own existence. How bitter it is to have to gather receipts just to answer an unfair accusation. But there, in front of all, those faces who had judged me minutes earlier, the truth began to gain weight. There were even printed emails where she asked me for money. Just this month, Dad, I swear. Printed texts where she had written, "You're the best dad in the world," just because I paid her credit card bill. The contrast between those sweet words of the past and the venom she had poured into that hole was so sharp that suddenly no one could keep pretending nothing was happening. And the silence that once belonged to me now belonged to them. And that was when I understood. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring what they had tried to destroy. My dignity, my name, my history. That folder, so ordinary on the outside, had become a symbol of something far greater. The memory of all I had done. The proof of the father I had been. The shield against the betrayal they tried to impose on me. Dichter. Then people started whispering among themselves, quietly, but I heard it. I didn't know he paid for all that. She never told us this. My God, he supported her for years. And me? I just watched. Because the greatest victory isn't humiliating someone back. It's showing, calmly and firmly, that truth comes with evidence, and that respect cannot be erased by a fit of vanity. The sound of the papers landing on the table seemed amplified. Every document I laid down, every receipt, every deed, cracked the ice in that room a little more. But it wasn't just any ice. It was the ice of arrogance disguised as indifference. The silence that filled the air was no longer one of contempt. It was one of embarrassment. The atmosphere shifted as if someone had cut the background music and switched on a bright, raw, unforgiving light, the kind that makes it impossible to hide flaws. And the eyes around me, once hard or distracted, now scanned the pages intently. The gossiping aunt stopped whispering. The cousin who fancied himself a businessman took off his glasses to read more closely. Even the son-in-law, always smug and arrogant, unfolded his arms. Some whispered quietly, but most simply stared. No one dared to speak, because in the face of hard evidence, even the sharpest tongues hesitate. And there it was, the facts, cruel, undeniable, and until that moment, invisible. Isun, my daughter, the same one who had condemned me out loud only minutes earlier, began to wilt. Her once straight posture sagged, her once defiant eyes avoided mine. She looked at those papers as if she were staring at a version of her life she'd rather not remember. And that's what terrifies those who betray. When the truth shows itself in the details, in the date on that tuition receipt, in the exact figure of that surgery bill, in the number on the lease agreement for the apartment she claimed she'd gotten on her own. And you know what's most powerful? It wasn't that I spoke, it was that I showed. While she shouted empty words, I let the papers speak for me. And paper, when it's proof, carries more weight than any speech. The signatures, the stamps, the statements, all of it began to weave a new narrative. Not the one she had tried to sell, but the real one. The one that existed. The one erased by ingratitude and resurrected by silence and truth. One by one, the guests changed their stance. You know that moment when someone realizes they bet on the wrong horse? That's what it was. Those who avoided me now looked with a mix of guilt and respect. Those who had crossed their arms now unfolded them. Those who whispered stopped. The entire room felt like it had been slapped awake. Nobody had expected that the old, outdated man, as she'd once called me in a text, would carry such robust, meticulously kept evidence. Their expressions spoke louder than words. It was as if they had all snapped out of a trance. That party, which had turned into a courtroom, was now transforming into the stage of a silent reversal. And the most striking part, no one knew how to react, because I hadn't insulted her, I hadn't shouted, I hadn't accused, just documents, just facts, just the cold edge of truth cracking the mask of a daughter who had forgotten where she came from. Some tried to lighten the mood, a forced smile here, a nervous joke there, desperate attempts to break the ice, but it was too late. The shame had changed sides, and the blame they had tried to dump on me had come boomeranging back, striking the one who deserved it. My ex-wife's face was twisted with discomfort. She knew. She had always known part of the story, but had chosen to ignore it. Seeing it there, in black and white, was like having a mirror shoved in front of her neglect. At one point, even the DJ, the young guy who had been quietly playing background music all night, lowered the volume completely, as if even he knew this moment demanded silence. It wasn't a time for melody. It was a time to face reality, a reality many in that room had helped distort, whether out of convenience or out of omission. And now, with everything exposed, no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. A man approached me, an old friend of my father's, a simple man, the type who doesn't speak much. He took my hand, looked me in the eye and said, "You're a man of dignity. You always have been." It was the only phrase that night that nearly broke me, because dignity, when it's recognized, has the power to heal wounds. Not all, but the deepest ones. And in that handshake, I felt respect beginning to be restored. My daughter, meanwhile, stayed silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of realization. The silence of someone who knew she had gone too far. Someone who had tried to erase an entire story with a single sentence. But words, no matter how sharp, don't stand against the weight of a life well lived. And my life, as quiet as it had been, was laid out on that table, in every page, in every number, in every signature. And maybe that was the greatest shock of all, realizing that the man they thought was outdated, out of touch, was a step ahead of everyone. Not in technology, not in appearance, but in posture, in preparation, in emotional strength. Because to remain composed in the face of humiliation, to keep evidence without malice, to wait for the right moment and let the truth speak without a single word, that isn't weakness. That is strength. That is strategy. That is dignity. Most people think turnarounds need noise, a dramatic line, a slammed door, a scandalous revenge. But the truth is, the most powerful reversals happen in silence. They don't need an audience cheering. They don't need shouting. They happen in the eyes, in the discomfort, in the sudden shift of perception. And that's exactly how mine began. Not with fireworks, but with presence. A presence steady and undeniable. And the room was no longer the same. The same place that hours earlier seemed to push me out was now pulling me back in. But I didn't return as the discredited man who had walked in trying to please. I returned as the man who stood tall through humiliation and exposed the truth without staining himself. And believe me, that changes everything. Because when someone witnesses injustice and then sees it repaired in silence, they can never look at the scene the same way again. My daughter was still there, but her posture had changed. The arrogance had evaporated. The proud tilt of her chin had collapsed into a stiff, motionless neck, as if she wanted to disappear inside herself. Her eyes flicked from the documents, to me, to the floor. It was as if she were searching for a safe place to land her gaze, but there was none. Because when truth surrounds you from all sides, There's nowhere to hide. All you can do is face it or lower your head, which is exactly what she did. And it wasn't just her. The reversal touched everyone. Those who had been so willing to believe her narrative now squirmed under the discomfort of having judged too soon. I could see it in the way they avoided my eyes, in the way they whispered among themselves. It was as if each of them had just been given a lesson about the power of appearances and the trap of half-truths. No one in that room could pretend ignorance anymore, and that put them in a new role, accomplices who now had to reconsider their own actions. The most interesting part is that I didn't need to do anything except hold my posture. The silence I had started earlier remained my greatest weapon. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't shout. See? Because when justice comes clothed in proof and maturity, it doesn't need excitement. It asserts itself. And the more I stayed silent, the more others began, speaking among themselves. Everything that needed to be said was already on the table, in letterhead, signed, and stamped. At a certain point, I felt it. The whole atmosphere had shifted. That sense of judgment dissolved completely, and in its place, something I hadn't felt in years appeared. Respect. Not forced respect, the kind that comes out of obligation, but genuine respect. The kind that comes when people realize they were wrong, even if they, can't admit it out loud. Even those who had never paid me much attention before started to approach more carefully, as if they wanted to somehow take part in my rebuilding. Too late, maybe, but still real. My daughter, realizing the room had changed sides, was left standing on nothing. And it wasn't about wounded pride, it was about harvest. What she had planted with neglect and vanity was now blooming into shame and isolation. What once looked like control now became loss. She no longer held the narrative. And for someone who thrives on appearances, that's the hardest blow, because when the audience turns, the performance loses its meaning. There's nothing more powerful than the moment a betrayer realizes they've lost the crowd, and that's exactly what happened. Her presence, once commanding, now made people uncomfortable. Some stepped away quietly, others avoided even looking at her. Little by little, the woman who seemed to be the center of the party turned into nothing more than a shameful detail in the background, a reminder of how quickly a public image crumbles when confronted with the truth. But I didn't want to humiliate her. That was never my plan. The pain she caused me wouldn't be erased with applause, nor with revenge. My turning point wasn't punishment for her. It was healing for me. It was the release of the burden I had carried, in silence for years. The certainty that I no longer needed to explain myself, that my story spoke for itself, that my dignity had outlasted the narrative of betrayal she tried to shove down everyone's throat. And the beauty of it all is that no one had to defend me. No one had to intervene, because the most powerful reversal is the one that stands on its own. I didn't have allies. I had evidence. I didn't need speeches. I just had to show what no one wanted to see for so long. And maybe that's why it hit so hard, because facts, when presented with elegance, cannot be denied. And that changes everything. Absolutely everything. Standing there, beside the table covered in documents, I realized I had recovered something even more valuable than other people's respect. I had recovered respect for myself, the right to look in the mirror without asking where I had gone wrong, because now it was clear. I hadn't failed as a father. She had failed as a daughter. And that truth, painful as it was, felt liberating, like a weight falling off my shoulders after years of carrying someone else's guilt. She took a long time to move, stood frozen for what felt, to me, like slow motion. Seconds, minutes, I couldn't tell. But then she finally lifted her eyes to mine, and there was no defiance left. The woman who had shouted as if I were an intruder in my own story now looked like a child, scared, ashamed, lost in her own voice. Her first attempt was a whisper, something between "Dad" and "I'm sorry," but it got swallowed by her hesitation. She knew that any words now would sound too small, and maybe they were, because some apologies only come after the damage has already spread, like a house burned down, with nothing left but ashes to sweep. Still, there was something sincere in her eyes, not performance, recognition, late but real. I didn't respond, at least not with words. I just looked at her, a long, heavy look that said, "Do you have any idea what you did?" And she understood. She dropped her eyes immediately. Shame overtook her body. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing grew heavier. And finally, with a trembling voice, she said, "I didn't know you had kept everything. I thought that." And she stopped. because there was no excuse, because she knew. The truth, she hadn't thought at all. She tried to come closer, lightly touched my arm, like someone asking for permission without knowing if it would be granted, and said again, this time louder, "I'm sorry, Dad," but the whole room heard it, and no one smiled, no one clapped, no one pretended, because everyone knew that apology wasn't full repentance. It was damage control, the plea of someone who realized, far too late, that she had lost the crowd and was now scrambling to salvage what little was left of her image. And me, I stayed silent, not out of pride, but because some apologies should not be answered right away. Not because they won't be accepted, but because the other person needs to feel the weight of what they caused, the betrayal, the humiliation, the exposure, and more than that, the disregard for everything done out of love. She needed to remember that moment, not just as a public shame, but as a moral turning point. Some people came up to me afterward trying to soften it. She's young. Sometimes they speak without thinking, or, these things happen in the best of families. But I didn't want comfort, or cheerleaders. I wanted her, for once, to face the truth without emotional crutches, without passing the blame. Because what happened there wasn't a slip, it was a choice, a string of small, cruel choices that built up to that night, and choices come with consequences. Finally, tears came, not the kind that make you the victim, but heavy tears, honest ones. Tears that fall not just from pain, but from shame. I saw them, I felt them, and though my heart was still wounded, a part of me, deep inside, felt compassion. Because loving a child, even when they disappoint you, is one of life's hardest contradictions. You don't switch off love, but you learn to put limits on it. Usually, she tried to hug me, and I let her, but it was a restrained hug, formal, the kind shared between two people who recognize each other but don't yet know how to rebuild the bridge they burned. It wasn't warm. It was heavy, the weight of regret, the weight of disappointment, the weight of lost time. And there, in the middle of that silent hall, it became clear to everyone, the damage had already been done, and forgiveness, even if it came, would never erase what had been revealed. And that's where the hard truth of life lies. Not every apology repairs the wound. Sometimes, it only acknowledges the fall, admits you went too far, that you crossed a line, and that's it. It isn't redemption. It's just the first step toward responsibility. And when that apology comes too late, it doesn't erase the past. It only forces us to live with it, as a scar, as a mark, as a warning. What she said next was even more painful, though it sounded sincere. Dad, I don't even know how to ask your forgiveness for everything. I just know I was selfish, very selfish. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't just an apology, it was a beginning, not a restart. That was still far away. But the first crack in the wall of pride she had built over the years, and only time would tell if that crack would open into a new path, or be patched over with easy excuses. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I gathered the papers with the same calm I had used to lay them out, one by one, folding them carefully, as if I were storing not just documents, but memories. The folder returned to my hands, heavy with truths, but lighter with regrets. And right then, I knew. Everything that needed to be said had been shown. No shouting, no insults, no performance. I looked around, saw faces unsettled, others regretful, and some simply silent, maybe reflecting on their own stories. My daughter still stood there, eyes downcast, as if waiting for something that wouldn't come in that moment. And she was right. It wasn't time for sweet words. It was time to learn from the emptiness she herself had created. Sometimes silence teaches more than any sermon. Before leaving, I took a deep breath. I walked toward the door, and without looking back, I said only one sentence. The shame was never mine, but the choice to carry it now is yours. And I left, head held high, folder under my arm, heart at peace. Not because of revenge, but because of liberation. Because there's a kind of respect you don't beg for, you impose. And that night, without raising my voice, I reclaimed mine. And now I ask you, how many times have you swallowed words just to keep the peace in your own home? How many times have you been called outdated, a burden, a disgrace, by the very people who only got where they are because you stayed quiet and held everything together? This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every father, mother, grandfather, or grandmother who has ever been erased by the very ones who should have been grateful. But it's also a reminder, dignity isn't begged for, it's built, and when the time comes, it speaks for you, even in silence. If you've lived something like this, share it in the comments. Your story matters, and if this message touched you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because we're going to keep telling the stories that expose what so many try to hide, that respect within the family isn't a luxury, it's a right.